Let's begin with the opening question: is God angry? Now, people who ask this question will point to some of the descriptions we find of God in the Old Testament, in particular, in which he appears to be harsh, mean, vengeful, and even violent in his treatment of people and of nations. We think of some of the severe penalties in the Mosaic Law: the death penalty for adultery or heresy or sorcery. The story of Uzzah reaching out to steady the ark when it was about to fall and being struck dead on the spot. We think about the bloodshed that we encounter, especially in the Old Testament, and what appear to be commands to totally destroy or wipe out a people or a nation. How do we handle these instances? Is God angry? Well, the first part of the answer to that question is yes, sometimes. Sometimes God is angry. But he's angry about the right things. He's angry about things he should be angry about, things that we would hope a good God would be angry about. Things like injustice and oppression and the exploitation of women and children and the poor and the disadvantaged. Things like the taking of human lives. I mean, don't we get angry about those things? Don't we get angry about child abuse and mass shootings and human trafficking and racial injustice? By the way, if you're not feeling angry about racial injustice, go see the film Just Mercy, which was just recently, and you'll be angry about the right things to be angry about. We should be angry about some of these things. We should try to stop them. We should try to restrain them. We try to protect people from them. Anger and love are not incompatible. When we love someone, we want to protect them and our relationship with them. And so, yes, sometimes God is angry, but he's angry about the right things, things that do harm to people and the world that he's made. But is he angry in the right ways? That's what people are really asking here. Is his anger over the top, severe, harsh, violent? And let's focus on that last one, because I think that's really the nub of this question. Is God violent? And if you've read much of the Old Testament, you can understand why people might ask that question. There are some troubling passages there. So before we look at one or two, let me give you the first of a handful of principles for handling difficult texts. And the first one is this: consider the historical, cultural context. In other words, in order to understand someone, you need to understand the world in which they live and even the language they speak. So the first thing we need to understand about the ancient world is how violent it was. It was a brutal environment, a constant struggle for survival and superiority. Might made right. The strong survived. The good died young. Nice guys finished last. That's the kind of world it was. And so when it came to interpersonal conflicts, disputes between people, there were no law enforcement agencies to offer protection and restraint. There were no elaborate court systems to settle disputes and to protect the innocent. Disputes were settled swiftly, impulsively, often with malice. And so the penalties that are called for here in the Mosaic Law, which appear to us to be a little bit severe and harsh, were actually a vast improvement over the customs of the times. For instance, people often point to the command we find in the scripture, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, as being brutal and barbaric. Well, the first thing we should know is that command actually originated in the Code of Hammurabi. Before the scriptures, the Bible merely quotes it. The second thing we should understand is that an eye for an eye is a whole lot better than two eyes for an eye, or a head for an eye, which is often how things worked in the ancient world. A third thing we'd want to understand is that it was probably never meant to be taken literally. It was a pithy, proverbial way of saying that the punishment should fit the crime. and of preventing evil or violence from escalating. When it came to national and international politics and conflict, again, it was a brutal environment. If you didn't wipe them out, they would try to wipe you out. Warfare has always been brutal. It was in the ancient world, and it is in the contemporary world. And if we're troubled sometimes by the number of casualties we read about in Old Testament stories, you don't want to know about the number of casualties, civilian casualties, in modern warfare. Even wars that we have had to wage, sometimes for just reasons. So warfare is deadly. But how about when we're told that God commanded the Israelites to utterly destroy a city? I mean, that sounds horrible. How do we understand those passages? Well, again, some of the history and culture will help us to understand it. First of all, we have to understand that the cities we read about in the Old Testament were not population centers like Boston or New York, where great numbers of people lived and worked and shopped. In the ancient world, people lived in villages. They lived and worked and shopped near their fields, away from the cities. The cities were generally military outposts. They were forts. In fact, the common Hebrew word for city is used interchangeably to describe a fortress. Let's take the city of Jericho, which we're told was totally destroyed by the Israelites, which sounds pretty awful. Well, scholars tell us that the city of Jericho was about 6 acres in size and probably housed a few hundred soldiers. The only civilian we know of in Jericho was Rahab, who ran a brothel, which is a common feature in a military outpost. What's more interesting is that the lone civilian we find in the city of Jericho was spared from the destruction along with her family. Another cultural factor to keep in mind is the frequent use of hyperbole in ancient accounts of warfare. Historians tell us it was very common in the ancient world for leaders and nations to greatly exaggerate the size of their armies or the scope of their victories. Historians will tell us it was an ancient form of trash talk that we're familiar with from the world of sports. The kind of thing you might hear two WWE wrestlers hurling at each other before a match. Hulk Hogan looking at an opponent and saying, "I'm going to tear you limb from limb." Hopefully, he's not literally going to do that. There are multiple accounts in Babylonian literature, Assyrian literature, and even in the Bible of cities being totally destroyed or of killing every man, woman, and child. Those things never actually happened. In fact, in many accounts, the people that we read were totally destroyed in one chapter end up showing up in the next chapter. It's ancient trash talk and saber rattling.